The Near Futurist, a podcast with Guy Clapperton. Hello, and thanks for streaming The Near Futurist, a show presented by me, Guy Clapperton. This week, we're going to revisit the area of health and the impact of technology. Regular listeners might remember I generally start by offering to moderate conferences and speak at them, and people have invited me to do so. It's been fun. At the moment, of course, even as we emerge from lockdown, and that could, of course, change by the time we go out, nobody's booking in-person events. I do, however, run online events such as webinars and roundtable discussions, and I've even presented podcasts for other people. It'll cost you, mind you. So do drop my assistant Nikki with an I, at clapperton.co.uk, a note for details if you're interested. But never mind about the self-publicity, let's get to my guest for the day, who qualified from King's College London in 1999 and trained in emergency medicine before starting his career in general practice 16 years ago. He joined the Hurley Clinic in 2006 and still practices across the Hurley Group in both general practice and urgent care settings. His current focus is to bring NHS care into the digital age, offering patients the ability to consult with their own NHS GP online and be triaged digitally in urgent and emergency care settings. His name is Dr. Murray Ellender, co-founder of eConsult. Murray, welcome.
All right, thank you very much for having me on.
You're more than welcome. Now, something that always interests me is when people come from one discipline, in your case obviously medicine, then cross into something else like business. There's a lot of skills to acquire. I suppose most general practitioners are actually independent, subcontracted by the NHS, but I'm just wondering, on a skills level, in terms of setting up a business or being a GP, what did you have to learn?
It's a really good point, and it's not something you do learn at medical school. You learn how to do the clinical stuff and how to be a doctor, but they don't really cover the how to run a business bit. But you're right, it's something that you do learn as a GP. So GPs are all effectively small businesses, and you kind of learn from, you join a partnership and you learn from your peers. So effectively, you've got to run a building, you've got to be an employer. I learned those skills really when I became a GP, which was about 15 years ago now. And we grew a kind of GP business from one practice up to about 15 practices. So actually I learned a lot also about kind of growing a business during that period. And I have to say, a lot of the skills, of course, transferable. Being a doctor is very much a people business, and kind of understanding people and building relationships with people. And as you know, running a business is a lot about people and the people you employ. So there's a lot of transferable skills, I'd say.
I suppose as a doctor as well, you've got to do that looking past the presenting problem. Somebody turns up to you and says they're getting headaches. They could be actually telling you, in some cases, that they're being abused or that they're getting anxiety attacks or something like that. But they're presenting to you with headaches. I mean, is any of that stuff, the reading of the surface, presenting symptoms, does any of that transfer to the business world, do you think?
I'd say it does. I mean, I think that's one of the key skills you learn as a GP. I think you, as a GP, we classically have about 10 minutes per patient. So you very quickly have to kind of get under the skin of that patient sat in front of you and understand what's wrong, and kind of, be able to read the signs in what they're saying or what they're telling you. And those skills are definitely all transferable. So yeah, it's very useful as well in terms of building relationships, building a rapport. When you're doing a morning surgery with maybe 20 patients and you've got to build a rapport very quickly with each one of those patients, that's a skill that very neatly transfers into the business world.
Perhaps not so easily if you're not actually physically face-to-face with somebody. I mean, obviously, let's take a step back and say that everybody is doing everything by Zoom right now, or other conferencing systems are available, of course. I'm wondering why medicine's been so far behind, particularly in the UK where we're based.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that's the question we asked ourselves a few years ago. I think if you look at other industries like banking, travel, shopping, we've been doing those online for many years. So why is health being so slow to adopt this? And I think a lot of it is actually just health's very personal to the individual. So I think it's kind of like maybe something harder to broach remotely. But it was one of the drivers for us, really. We had patients, but we'd been seeing all these patients in the same way we had been for the last 50 years. This drove us to try something new, which then led us to founding this business. So we knew that digital held some key to helping make the NHS more sustainable, and wanted to try something different, and knew that actually the model of general practice, where you bring every single patient into a building to be seen face to face, hadn't really changed for 50, 60 years. So we looked at what technology could do to help with that, which was really how we founded the business 6, 7 years ago.
On the other hand, there's some things you can't do. I mean, my doctor's favourite trick is if you dare walk within 30 yards of the surgery and you're over 40, they pop you on the scales. You don't get the choice. You are on those scales. It doesn't matter if you came in with an ingrowing toenail, you're on the blasted scales. So that's the sort of thing you can't do, I assume, that's an obvious example. But
Yeah.
are there those things that you can miss if you're not face to face?
It's an interesting point, but I think what perhaps patients don't realize, or a lot of doctors don't realize, is if you look at a normal GP surgery in the a kind of normal morning of a GP, actually you don't lay your hands on every single patient. So there's most of medicine actually is gleaned, the diagnosis is gleaned from speaking to the patient. So it's that kind of taking of a history, the story, and understanding that what's wrong with the patient. And actually, usually when you examine them, that's really just to confirm what you've already found out. Now, you're right, you can't do everything remotely. So there's always going to be patients we're going to have to bring in to be seen. But what we're doing is we're saying, look, actually those patients that can be managed remotely, let's manage them remotely. And actually let's free up GPs' time so they can spend more time face-to-face with those patients they really do need to see. So yes, I guess that opportunistic jump on the weighing scales may not be happening as regularly. But why not just ask the patient what their weight is? They don't, we don't have to do that within the GP surgery. We could trust the patient to tell us that.
That could be just about as reliable as asking them how many units of alcohol they drink per week, of course, and that nobody tells you about that. I just don't believe a word of it. But more seriously, there are precedents, aren't there? I interviewed a doctor in India some years ago. I mean, I did it remotely. I wasn't in India, but he was doing a lot of diagnoses by video conference because the sheer size of that territory and the structure of their health spend made it essential to be able to get experts in virtually. I'm just wondering if there have been pilot projects in the UK before your particular business.
There have. Certainly, there's a number of kind of pilot sites that have tried video, and certainly the hospital doctors are now doing kind of outpatients by video. Video is an interesting one because actually we don't do a great deal of video consulting, because actually what we found is that video doesn't offer a huge amount over the telephone. So when we started out, we did that kind of classic Skype consult with your patient. But what we found is it doesn't really save any time. You still need that 10 minutes for a doctor and 10 minutes for a patient at the same time. And the other thing, the challenge that we found when testing video is that the infrastructure isn't very good in most GP surgeries. So actually the broadband's not very good. And as soon as you've got a couple of doctors on a video call, it all grinds to a halt. So we then came up with this different idea, which actually let's gather the story from the patient. So gather that history, do that via your practice website, get the patient to answer a series of questions, and then put that information in front of the GP and get the GP to make a decision. And we did this with our own patients. And then we did a pilot in Tower Hamlets, a kind of 6-month pilot, which was looked at externally and added a great deal of value. And that's kind of how the thing kicked off. The NHS is very good at piloting things. It's then changing those pilots into kind of scalable solutions. That's always the thing that the NHS has struggled with historically.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm interested in your point of view about the infrastructure issue. The other thing I suppose you must be facing if you did try to do things by video is the infrastructure at the other end, the patient's own infrastructure. For example, if I were to say, I've got a rash here and hold it up to a camera, A, I've got to be holding it in the right place. B, you've got to have a good enough picture being transmitted and also being displayed on your screen. There's a lot of variables in there, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
There are. And if you look at the volume of kind of general practice delivered today, even post-COVID and remotely, actually still only a very small percentage is done by video. There's a lot of remote consultations happening, but they're happening through systems like ours, where actually you gather that history from the patient up front. And with that history, you can gather a photo. So you don't have to have a live video feed, which is often not great resolution, but you could get a photo from the patient and attach that. It's effectively like a structured email. So it doesn't require huge bandwidth. Technically for the patient, it's relatively easy to do. We do lots of patient research to make sure it's as easy and frictionless for the patient as possible. But nevertheless, it's not for everyone. You are going to get patients who can't do this, and that's fine. Actually, I'm always of the view that we should be trying to take the people who are kind of online, adept online, take those online, And the people who aren't, we'll let them come in by kind of traditional routes. But actually, it should be easier for them to come in now because we've freed up GPs' time by taking those online savvy people online.
Do you want to sound as confident as my interviewee in this episode? If you talk to the press or other media, are you worried you'll be misquoted, or they'll just publish their story and not yours? Clapperton Media Associates can help with coaching. Drop me a note, guy@clapperton.co.uk, and we'll arrange a time for an exploratory call. Now, back to the podcast. I was going to ask about that because, of course, as I think I mentioned to you, to your colleague in the initial briefing, I had a neighbour who needed a bit of help with some form filling online, and I said to him, "That's easy. Just take a photo of that document, attach it to the email." He had no idea how you did that. Number first of all, told me he spent an awful lot of money on a very expensive kit without knowing how to use it. That's his right. But there are those issues where it's not realistic for a GP to go virtual if the patients are not well-informed and relatively tech-savvy people, as you say.
It's very true. And I think, the other thing is kind of language that you use on any kind of website. We've got the average reading age in the UK is 8. So when we kind of author all the questions that we put in front of patients, we get doctors to write these questions, but they typically write them in kind of doctor speak. So we then put it through a panel who take it down to a kind of plain English and make sure that actually someone with a reading age of 8 could cope with these questions. And we also then make the platform as easy to use as possible. So yeah, you're right. Technically, even attaching a photo from your desktop to an email is actually quite difficult. Whereas actually, if you're on if the message from the GP is as simple to a patient as, look, either use the NHS app or go to your practice website and take it from there. Once they land on the practice website, it should be a very easy journey for that patient. So even if they're not particularly digitally literate, it should be easy for them to follow, so that when they have to upload a photo, it kind of talks them through it step by step. So we're very mindful of that. Actually, you've got to make this journey as easy for the patients as possible. You can't make it overly complex, or they just won't engage with it.
And of course, there are some people, even now, who are simply not online, and particularly in the older population, quite elderly, reject the idea of going online, and that is their right, inconvenient though it may be to you and I, and it's okay, we can say that. They won't be listening, this show's going online. Now,
Good point.
So, didn't mean that. But getting back to the more serious stuff again, I'm assuming that COVID-19 has made this sort of thing even more prevalent, partly because of the pressure on the health service, and also because of people's reluctance to go into actual premises. Can you tell me something about that?
Yes, sadly, it's taken a kind of global health crisis in order to really drive the digital healthcare revolution, not just here, but around the world. But it certainly has done that in the NHS. And we've seen a significant uptake in the use of the platform. And that means both the kind of number of practices that use it. So there's about 7,000 practices in the UK, and we were in about 1,500 of them at the start of this crisis. We're now in over 3,000 practices. So getting on for half of them. And there are other platforms in use in other practices. So most GP surgeries now have an online route in for patients, that patients can go to the practice website and then consult with their own doctor online. And the other thing that's really driven is usage of the platform, because you're absolutely right, people stopped going into the physical buildings. GPs had to think about, well, actually, how can I manage these patients remotely? So kind of this time last year, we were seeing maybe 10 or 12,000 online consults coming through our system every month. We're now seeing 800,000 coming through a month. So the volume of people using this as a way to contact their own GP has just gone through the roof, which is good in a way, because it opens both patients' eyes to this new way of consulting with their doctor, and it also opens the GP's eyes. And the GPs now go, actually, this kind of works. It doesn't work for everything. There's still some patients I'm going to have to see, but there's a good amount of activity in patients that I can manage without bringing them physically into the building. And this works fine. I can, I've got their information about, say, their back pain. I've got their medical record. I can issue a prescription. I can send that electronically now to a pharmacy, and I can send the patient a message with some links to some self-help advice, say. So you can kind of, you can conduct a lot of this remotely now.
So what have your milestones been? What have you done so far? And can you talk me through the process? Let's say I want to use eConsult, or rather my
Mhm.
GP surgery is using eConsult as a patient or indeed as a doctor. What actually happens?
Yeah, but it was really important to us that we were linking patients to their own GP. We didn't want patients to kind of have to register with a particular kind of digital practice in order to have a digital experience. So we're trying to kind of digitize your own registered GP so that actually wherever you're registered, you should be able to have a digital experience. And the route in for a patient is that you go either to the practice website or you can download the NHS app. So there's an NHS app that allows you to book appointments with your GP or order prescriptions, but now also to actually consult with your doctor. And what you go in with maybe a symptom, so you might be feeling depressed, or you might have a sore throat, or you might think I need some medication. The system will ask you a series of questions about your condition. It's got lots of safety built into it. So actually, if the system suspects that this is a bit more urgent, it will route you into a more urgent channel. But generally, that information is then deposited at your GP surgery, and the patient gets told that they'll get a call back that same day. So you as a patient then you will get either you'll get a phone call back, or actually more often than not, you'll get a message back from your GP. Because once they've looked at this information, they can often issue a prescription or some advice and deliver that back to you by email, by SMS, or if they have to, they can ring you. Or actually, sometimes, occasionally, we might do a video call. You know, if there's a cause to do a video call at that point, once we've kind of worked out that might benefit this particular patient, we'll initiate one of those. And probably in about 10-20% of cases that these online consults come in, I'll need to examine you. So say you had a child with abdominal pain. Invariably, I'm going to need to see that child. So I've got the history bit, but actually I'm going to have to arrange to see you. But I can then prioritize you. I can say, well, actually, I need to see you this morning, or actually I can book you in on Thursday with a nurse, say. So you can start to prioritize these cases as well. So that's the kind of the journey for the patient. They go online to the practice website or use the NHS app to access the care.
Okay, now one concern I would have, being a bit of a cynic, but having done a long time ago, but a little bit of work in the public sector, is if you save a bit of money, then the managers
Mm-hmm.
will look at that and think, oh, good, efficiencies. And rather than
Mm-hmm.
redeploy resources, which they could do to say, I don't know, more nurses or a new kidney machine or, as we have one in the family, I should say, better conditions for hospital porters. They they just think, oh, efficiencies, we can cut, we can spend less. How do you stop this, the eConsult and services like it becoming Trojan horses for cutbacks?
It's a good question, and they definitely shouldn't be. I mean, the thing I would say is that the technology itself is relatively cheap. So, it's not like this doesn't cost a lot of money to deliver the service. But what it does do is it makes the wider NHS more sustainable. And now, if you speak to any GP, even going kind of before we went into COVID, most GPs were really struggling with workload, and it was almost becoming unsustainable. The relentless demand from patients, actually, GPs were. There's a lot of press about it last year. Lots of GPs leaving the profession because they were burnt out, they weren't coping. And what this does is it's making the job more sustainable. So it's kind of allowing GPs to get some headspace and to be able to kind of cope with the job that they were doing and the great job they do. So I think in a world where there's ever increasing demand, this is a way of managing that demand and making the NHS and both doctors and also probably ultimately hospital doctors' workload more sustainable.
You've been
So
very
I can't see that happening.
We've been very UK centric. We've been talking about the NHS. I'm aware that a number of our listeners are in the US and elsewhere. Is the same thing happening worldwide?
It certainly is. So there are definitely moves to do a lot more healthcare management remotely, and I think, like the UK, a lot of the talk in in the last few years has been around kind of video, but I think people are starting to realize that actually video doesn't save any time, and we should be doing more of this kind of this idea of triaging, i.e., gathering the information from the patient up front and then deciding how urgent they need to be seen. And that is certainly happening in places all across the world. So our own personal focus on the NHS, because I think there's enough to kind of do in the NHS now. But if you look to other countries, there's definitely similar things going on at the moment. The US health system is slightly different because there, in a way, you're the way the funding works, you're almost incentivized to see people face to face because you're paid for every patient you see. So I think there may be differences in how different health systems apply the technology, but certainly, there's great examples all around the world of innovation happening now, and kind of driving that digital health revolution that we've all been waiting for.
Final question, that's the one I always ask, is where people can find out more about yourself and your organization.
So the best place is to go to our website. So either just Google eConsult or www.econsult.net. And there's lots of information about what we're doing in general practice and also what we're starting to do now in A&E, digitizing that journey too. So that's the best place to go.
Dr. Murray Ellender of eConsult, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Guy. It's been a pleasure.
And many thanks to you for listening. That was the Near Futurist podcast with me, Guy Clapperton. Don't forget to have a look at the website at nearfuturist.co.uk or my media training site at remotemediatraining.com. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Stay safe.